Nobody in that Ohio courtroom knew they were about to witness something they would talk about for the rest of their lives. Not the attorneys in their pressed suits, shuffling papers with practiced indifference. Not the court stenographer who had sat in that same chair for 16 years and believed she had seen everything worth seeing. Not the bailiff standing stiff and expressionless by the heavy oak door, counting down the minutes until his lunch break. Not even the spectators who had packed every wooden bench in the public gallery that morning, whispering to one another in the hushed, reverent tones people use in hospitals and churches and courtrooms, places where life has a tendency to change without warning. Nobody knew. But something in that room felt different from the moment the morning session was called to order. A tension that had no obvious source. A stillness that felt less like calm and more like the world holding its breath before something enormous arrived. It was a bitter Tuesday in March, the kind of cold that gets into your bones and refuses to leave. Outside the Franklin County Courthouse in Columbus, Ohio, frost still clung to the iron railings along the front steps, and the sky above the city was the flat, colorless gray of old concrete. Inside, the heat was cranked too high, the way it always is in government buildings in winter, and the air smelled of old wood and coffee, and the particular kind of anxiety that collects in rooms where people's futures get decided by strangers. Courtroom 7 was full. Every seat in the public gallery had been taken since 8:30 that morning, an unusual thing for a family court proceeding, which typically draws only the people who are legally required to be there. But word had traveled through the courthouse hallways in the way that significant things always travel, quietly, quickly, and with a kind of weight attached that makes people stop what they're doing and pay attention. There was a child involved, a very young child, and something about the case, the details, the circumstances, the sheer heartbreak folded inside the paperwork, had drawn people in like a current pulling everything toward the center of a river. The attorneys were already seated at their respective tables when the clock on the wall clicked over to 9. On the left side of the room, the legal team representing the County Child Welfare Department arranged and rearranged their files with the focused energy of people preparing for something they knew mattered. On the right, a court-appointed defense attorney sat alone, reviewing notes on a yellow legal pad, his pen moving in small, tight circles at the margin of the page, a nervous habit he probably didn't know he had. At the bench, the chair of the Honorable Margaret Albright sat empty. Judge Albright was known throughout Franklin County as the kind of person who commanded a room without raising her voice. 61 years old, sharp-eyed, precise in her language and her expectations, she had spent 22 years on the family court bench presiding over cases that would have broken most people: custody battles, termination of parental rights hearings, child abuse proceedings that required a person to read things no human being should have to read, and then walk back into a courtroom and remain composed. She had done it thousands of times. She had developed the particular kind of controlled stillness that people develop when they have learned, through long experience, that falling apart helps no one. People said she never flinched. People said nothing surprised her anymore. People were about to be wrong. At 9:03, the bailiff straightened and called the room to attention. And then the heavy doors at the back of courtroom 7 swung open. The first thing people saw was the dog. He was large, a golden retriever with a coat the color of warm honey, broad-shouldered and calm, moving with the unhurried, deliberate confidence of an animal that has been places and understands its purpose. His eyes swept the room without alarm, taking in the crowd, the lights, the noise, the energy, processing all of it and deciding, apparently, that none of it was a threat. He wore a blue therapy vest across his chest, and at the end of his leash walked a quiet, gray-haired man in a carefully pressed shirt. Harold Voss, retired schoolteacher, certified therapy dog handler, a man who had dedicated the last 6 years of his life to walking into difficult rooms with this dog and trusting what happened next. But it was the child at Harold's side who made the entire room go silent. She was 3 years old. 3 years old, which is such a small age to be walking into a place like this, carrying whatever she was carrying, surrounded by all the formal, grinding machinery of a legal system that was trying, in its imperfect and bureaucratic way, to figure out what to do with her life. Her name was Lily Mee Harmon. She had dark curls that bounced slightly with each step, and she was wearing a soft blue sweater and small brown boots that made quiet sounds on the hard courtroom floor. Her face was still, not the stillness of a shy child hiding behind a parent's leg, but a deeper, more unsettling stillness. The stillness of a child who has learned that the world is unpredictable and that keeping very quiet and very small is the safest way to move through it. She was holding the leash herself. That detail struck people later when they tried to describe what they had seen. Not the handler holding the leash and the child walking alongside. Lily was holding the leash, and Scout, this large, calm, golden dog, was walking beside her, as though his only job in the entire world was to be exactly where she was, as though leaving her side was simply not something he was capable of considering. They walked together down the center aisle of the courtroom. People leaned forward in the gallery. Attorneys looked up from their papers. The stenographer's hands went still over her keys. Nobody spoke. There are moments in life that announce themselves before you understand them, moments where something in the air shifts and your body recognizes that what you are witnessing is significant before your mind has caught up to explain why. This was one of those moments. Every person in courtroom 7 felt it, though most of them couldn't have articulated it. They were watching a 3-year-old girl who hadn't spoken in 6 months walk into the most formal and intimidating room she had ever entered, guided by no one, holding onto only a leash, and the dog at the end of it. And somehow, inexplicably, she didn't look afraid. She looked like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Dana Pressler, the child's social worker, followed 2 steps behind, her expression carefully neutral in the practiced way of someone fighting hard to hold their composure in a public place. She had fought for months to get this child the right support. She had filed the paperwork, made the calls, pushed through the objections, and sat in this building arguing for Lily's needs until her voice went hoarse. She knew what was at stake today. She also knew something nobody else in that room knew yet, except Harold Voss and Dr. Karen Osai and Scout himself. She knew about the signal. Lily and Scout reached the specially arranged seating area near the front of the courtroom. Scout settled onto his designated mat with the quiet efficiency of a professional. Lily sat in the chair beside him, folded her small hands in her lap, and looked down at her boots. The bailiff cleared his throat. Judge Margaret Albright entered from the side door, robe straight, posture perfect, expression composed and unreadable. She took her seat at the bench, surveyed the room with the calm authority of someone entirely accustomed to being the most prepared person in any space she occupies, and called the proceeding to order. The hearing began. And for the next 40 minutes, everything appeared to proceed exactly as a family court hearing in Franklin County, Ohio, was supposed to proceed. But Scout never stopped watching Lily. And Lily, without moving, without speaking, without giving any outward sign that anything was wrong, was getting closer and closer to the moment when she would need him. When that moment came, it would last less than 10 seconds. It would stop everything. And it would start with the smallest, most silent gesture in the room. There is a particular kind of loneliness that exists inside silence. Not the comfortable silence of a quiet evening or the peaceful silence of a sleeping house. This was a different kind entirely. The silence of a child who had decided, somewhere deep in the part of herself that made decisions before conscious thought could interfere, that the world outside her own mind was no longer safe enough to speak into. That was the silence Lily Mee Harmon was living in when Scout arrived. And that was the silence that Scout, without training manuals or therapy degrees or any of the tools the adults around Lily had been desperately reaching for, somehow began to find his way through. Nobody could fully explain how he did it. That was the part that stayed with everyone who witnessed it. The therapists, the social workers, the researchers who later reviewed the documentation. All of them, at some point, ran out of clinical language to describe what they were seeing, and simply had to sit with the fact that something was happening between this child and this dog that operated outside the boundaries of what they knew how to measure. Dr. Karen Ose had been a licensed child trauma therapist for 15 years. She had worked with children who had experienced some of the most devastating circumstances imaginable. She had sat in small, carefully decorated therapy rooms across Columbus listening to silences of every variety and texture. She knew how to be patient. She knew how to wait. She knew that healing moved on its own schedule, and that the worst thing a therapist could do was try to force it forward before it was ready. But she had never seen anything like what happened when Scout entered the room. The first session had been deliberately low pressure. Harold Voss brought Scout in quietly, kept him on a loose leash, and simply allowed the dog to exist in the same space as Lily without any expectation or instruction. Dr. Ose sat to one side, observing. Dana Pressler stood near the door, barely breathing. For the first 7 minutes, Lily sat completely still in her small chair and ignored Scout entirely. Or appeared to. Later, reviewing the session notes, Dr. Ose wrote that she believed Lily was in fact intensely aware of Scout from the very first second, that the stillness wasn't indifference but a kind of suspended evaluation. The child was watching, in her own internal way, deciding whether this new presence in her world was something she could afford to trust. Then Scout moved. He didn't do anything dramatic. He simply shifted his weight and repositioned himself approximately 2 inches closer to where Lily was sitting, and then exhaled one long, slow, unhurried breath that seemed to say, without any ambiguity whatsoever, "I am not going anywhere. I am not asking anything of you. I am simply here." Lily turned her head and looked at him. It was the first time in 3 therapy sessions that she had made eye contact with anything in the room. She looked at him for a long moment, studying his face, his eyes, the slow rise and fall of his golden chest. Then she reached out her small hand and placed it flat against his side, pressing her palm into the warm, soft fur as though she was checking for something. A heartbeat, maybe. Proof of something alive and steady in a world that had recently shown her how quickly and completely things could stop being okay. Scout didn't move, didn't shift away, didn't do anything except breathe. Harold Voss said afterward that in 6 years of therapy work with Scout, he had learned to read the dog's responses the way a musician learns to read a score, with attention to the smallest details, the barely perceptible shifts in posture and breath and muscle tension that communicated more than words ever could. In that moment, he said, Scout was doing something deliberate. He was being an anchor. Dr. Ose stepped out of the room to write her notes in the hallway. Dana Pressler followed her and cried for 5 minutes against the wall outside the door. Something had opened, something small and fragile and enormously important. Over the weeks that followed, that something grew. Scout began coming to Lily's sessions 3 times a week, each visit built on the last in ways that were not always visible in the moment but became clear when Dr. Ose stepped back and looked at the pattern of her notes across time. Lily was changing. Not loudly, there were no sudden breakthroughs, no dramatic moments of transformation. It was slower and quieter than that, and more real for being so. She started guiding Scout by his leash during the last 10 minutes of each session, walking him slowly around the perimeter of the therapy room, her small hand gripping the leather with surprising confidence. She began making deliberate eye contact during sessions, first with Scout, and then, occasionally, with Dr. Ose, glances that lasted only a second but carried enormous weight. She began responding to yes or no questions with small physical gestures, a slight nod, a barely perceptible shake of the head, which she had previously refused to do with anyone. And once, just once in the 4th week, she smiled. It was tiny, a flash of something at the corner of her mouth, gone almost before it registered. Harold Voss caught it first and had to look away at the wall. Dr. Osei noted the exact time in her documentation and underlined it twice. What was Scout doing that the humans around Lily couldn't? Dr. Osei thought about this question constantly during those weeks. She discussed it with colleagues, reviewed the existing literature on animal-assisted trauma therapy, and consulted with a neurobiologist friend who studied the physiological effects of human-animal bonding on stress response systems. The answers were both scientific and somehow insufficient. Scientifically, the research was clear. Physical contact with a calm animal, particularly stroking fur, triggers measurable reductions in cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, while simultaneously increasing oxytocin levels. A regulated nervous system communicates safety to a dysregulated one through proximity and synchronized breathing, a process researchers called co-regulation. And Scout, with his slow, steady breathing and his warm, unhurried presence, was essentially teaching Lily's traumatized nervous system how to find its way back to calm. But there was something beyond the science that Dr. Osei kept returning to in her notes. Scout made no demands. Every human being in Lily's life, however well-intentioned, however gentle, however carefully trained, came into the room carrying expectations. The expectation of progress, the expectation of response, the barely concealed hope that today might be the day something shifted, that the child might speak, might open up, might give them some sign that their efforts were reaching her. Children who have been traumatized are extraordinarily sensitive to the emotional states of the adults around them. It is, in a terrible way, a survival skill developed out of necessity. Lily could feel every expectation in every room she entered, and it kept her locked tight. Scout expected nothing. He didn't need her to get better. He didn't need her to speak. He didn't need her to perform recovery for an audience. He simply needed to be near her, and he communicated that need in the most uncomplicated and irrefutable way possible, by showing up, session after session, and lying down beside her as though being beside her was the most natural and necessary thing in the world. For a child who had learned that the people who were supposed to keep her safe could not be trusted, Scout offered something revolutionary. He offered consistency without condition. It was in the 6th week that Dr. Osei introduced the signal system. She had been developing it carefully, building a small vocabulary of nonverbal gestures that Lily could use to communicate her needs without requiring speech. Most were simple and practical: a raised palm for stop, a downward wave for I need a break, a slow nod for yes, and a small head turn for no. But one gesture was different from the others. Dr. Osei introduced it on a Wednesday afternoon, sitting on the floor across from Lily with Scout between them. She demonstrated it slowly and clearly, 2 fingers pressed gently to the center of the chest, held there for a moment, and then extended outward toward Scout. I need you, she explained quietly. Come to me, I'm not okay. She demonstrated it again, then she looked at Lily. Lily watched her with those wide, serious eyes for a long moment. Then, with the careful deliberateness of a child who understood that this was important, she pressed 2 fingers to her own small chest and extended them toward Scout. Scout stood up immediately and moved to her, pressing his head into her lap. The first time it worked, Lily looked down at the dog in her lap and then up at Dr. Osei, with an expression that Dr. Osei would later spend considerable time trying to find the right word for. The closest she could get was this: recognized. As though Lily had just discovered that she had a voice after all. It just didn't require words. They practiced it every session after that. Again and again, 2 fingers to the chest, extended outward, and Scout responding every single time with the immediate, unwavering certainty of an animal that has been given one purpose and holds it sacred. Nobody in that small therapy room could have known, in those quiet Wednesday afternoons, that the world was going to see that signal used for real very soon. In a packed courtroom, under fluorescent lights, in front of a judge who had believed for 22 years that she had seen everything. None of them knew. But Scout was ready. He was always ready. There is a reason courtrooms are designed the way they are. The high ceilings, the heavy wood, the elevated bench where the judge sits above everyone else, looking down at the proceedings with the detached authority of someone who has been granted, by law and by society, the power to decide what happens next. Every element of a courtroom is intentional, designed to communicate, without a single word being spoken, that this is a place of order, of procedure, of rules that exist for reasons and cannot simply be set aside because someone has a good story or a compelling argument or a 3-year-old girl who hasn't spoken in 6 months, and a golden retriever who might be the only living creature capable of reaching her. The American legal system is many things. Flexible is not always one of them. Which is why, when Dana Pressler first walked into the pre-hearing conference room 3 weeks before the scheduled court date and proposed, calmly, professionally, with all the measured composure she could assemble, that a certified therapy dog be permitted to accompany Lily Mee Harmon into courtroom 7 for the duration of the child welfare hearing, the reaction from the legal team was not what she had hoped for. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when someone has said something that everyone present considers slightly absurd, but is too polite to say so directly. Then the county's lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Gerald Fitch who had been practicing family law for 27 years and wore his skepticism like a second suit, leaned back in his chair and said, with the particular brand of condescension that comes from decades of winning arguments, "A dog. In my courtroom." It wasn't a question, it was a verdict. Dana had expected this. She had prepared for this. She had spent 3 evenings at her kitchen table after her children went to bed, surrounded by printed research papers and highlighted case files and cold cups of coffee, building the most thorough and airtight argument she was capable of constructing. She knew that walking into that conference room with anything less than an overwhelming, irrefutable case would result in a door being closed that she might never get open again. She opened her folder and began. She cited a 2011 study from the University of California demonstrating measurable reductions in anxiety and cortisol levels in child witnesses who were permitted contact with certified therapy dogs before and during testimony. She referenced a 2014 landmark case in Indiana, where a facility dog named Rosie had been approved for use during a child abuse trial, a decision that was subsequently upheld on appeal and cited in courts across 17 states. She presented documented evidence from courthouse facility dog programs in Arizona, Idaho, New York, and Colorado, programs that had been running successfully for years, with formal protocols, trained handlers, and 0 reported incidents of courtroom disruption. She presented Dr. Karen Osai's clinical assessment of Lily's current psychological state, a document that was precise, devastating, and impossible to dismiss. Dr. Os had written, in the careful language of someone who chooses every word deliberately, that Lily Mee Harmon's nervous system had been so severely dysregulated by trauma that exposure to the procedural stress of a courtroom hearing without appropriate therapeutic support carried a significant risk of acute psychological crisis. She had written that Scout's presence was not a comfort measure or a sentimental accommodation. It was a clinical necessity. And then Dana put down her papers and looked Gerald Fitch directly in the eye and said something that wasn't in any of her research documents. This child has been failed by every system that was supposed to protect her. She is 3 years old and she has not spoken in 6 months. We are asking for a dog on a mat. If we can't give her that, then what exactly are we here for? The room was quiet again. A different kind of quiet this time. Gerald Fitch looked down at the table for a moment. Then he looked back up at Dana and said, with considerably less condescension than before, that the motion would need to go to Judge Albright and that he would not formally oppose it. It was not a victory, but it was a door left open. The motion landed on Judge Margaret Albright's desk on a Thursday afternoon in late February. She was in the middle of 3 other active cases, a stack of sentencing reviews, and a continuing legal education requirement that needed to be completed before the end of the month. Her clerk, a young woman named Patricia who had worked for her for 4 years and understood exactly how to read the judge's moods, placed the motion on top of the pile with a small note attached that said simply, "This one's different." Judge Albright read the note. Then she picked up the motion and began to read. She read all 32 pages. She was not a person who skimmed. She never had been. It was one of the qualities that had made her exceptional at her job and occasionally maddening to work with, this absolute insistence on reading everything completely, understanding every argument fully, before forming a single opinion. She had developed this habit early in her career after making a ruling she later regretted because she had trusted a summary instead of the source material. She had never made that mistake again. She read Dr. Osai's clinical assessment twice. She read the case law from Indiana, from Arizona, from New York. She pulled 2 of the cited studies directly from the court's legal database and read those as well. She made notes in the margin, small, precise annotations in her distinctive handwriting, questions and observations and cross-references that she would follow up on before making any decision. On Friday morning, she called 2 child psychology experts she trusted, people she had worked with on previous cases, whose judgment she respected, and whose opinions she knew would be honest rather than accommodating. She asked them both the same question. In your professional assessment, would the presence of a certified therapy dog with a trained handler represent a genuine clinical benefit to a severely traumatized 3-year-old child in a high-stress legal proceeding? Or is this an emotional accommodation being dressed up in clinical language? Both of them said the same thing. It was real. The research was solid. The benefit was genuine. And the risk of not providing appropriate support to a child in Lily's psychological condition was, in their assessment, considerably greater than any procedural inconvenience the accommodation might cause. Judge Albright thanked them, ended both calls, and sat at her desk for a while. She thought about the cases she had presided over in 22 years, the children she had seen come through her courtroom, some of them so young, so damaged, so lost inside the machinery of a system that was trying to help them but often struggled to remember that they were children first and cases second. She thought about the times she had felt, sitting behind that bench, that the law was doing its job, and the times she had felt that it wasn't. She thought about a little girl in a blue sweater who hadn't spoken in 6 months. She thought about what it must take to walk into a room like Courtroom 7 when you are 3 years old, and the world has already shown you how badly it can hurt you. She picked up her pen. She read through the proposed conditions one final time: scout to remain on a designated mat at all times, handled exclusively by certified trainer Harold Voss, immediate removal protocol in place if any disruption occurred, no direct interaction between the dog and any court official or attorney during proceedings, full documentation of the therapeutic rationale on the court record. The conditions were thorough. They were reasonable. They protected the integrity of the proceeding while acknowledging the reality of what this child needed. She signed the approval. Then she set her pen down, straightened the papers on her desk, and returned to the rest of her pile. She didn't tell anyone what she had decided until Patricia filed the signed order late that afternoon and word began spreading through the courthouse with the particular quiet velocity of news that people recognize as significant. Gerald Fitch received the signed order at 4:57 and read it twice before putting it down. Dana Pressler received her copy at 5:03, sitting in her car in the parking garage, and pressed her forehead against the steering wheel for a full minute before she trusted herself to drive. Harold Voss got the call at 5:30 while he was giving Scout his evening walk around the neighborhood. He stopped on the sidewalk and stood still for a moment, looking down at the dog beside him. Scout looked back up at him with those amber eyes that seemed to understand more than they should. "We're going in," Harold said quietly. Scout's tail moved once, a single, slow wag, and then he turned his head forward and kept walking, steady and calm and absolutely certain, the way he always was. The way he always would be. 3 weeks later, they walked through the doors of Courtroom 7 together. And nothing in that building, nothing in that city, would ever be quite the same again. The alarm on Dana Pressler's phone went off at 5:15 in the morning. She was already awake. She had been awake since 3:42, lying in the dark with her eyes open, running through the day ahead the way she always did before a significant hearing, mentally checking every detail, every document, every contingency she had prepared for. Except this time, the checklist kept circling back to one thing that no amount of preparation could fully account for. Lily. How would Lily be in the morning? Would she eat breakfast? Would she allow Dana to help her get dressed? Or would the unfamiliarity of the day already be pushing her into that deep, unreachable stillness that came over her when the world felt too large and too unpredictable to navigate? Would Scout's presence be enough to keep her grounded in a room full of strangers and fluorescent lights, and the particular suffocating formality of a place where serious things happened to people who had no control over any of it? Dana didn't know. She couldn't know. And not knowing was the hardest part of her job, the part that followed her home every evening and sat at the foot of her bed and refused to leave. She got up at 5:30, made coffee she barely tasted, and was in her car by 6:15. Across the city, in a small ranch house on the east side of Columbus, Harold Voss had been awake since 4. He was not typically an anxious person. 6 years of walking into difficult rooms with Scout had gradually sanded away most of the edges of his nervousness, replacing them with a kind of practiced steadiness that he had come to rely on the way other people relied on caffeine or routine. He trusted Scout. He trusted the work. He trusted that the thing that happened between this dog and the people who needed him was real, and would continue to be real regardless of how many attorneys or officials or courtroom procedures surrounded it. But this was different. He felt the difference in his chest when he woke up, a low hum of something that wasn't quite anxiety but was adjacent to it. The awareness that today was not a therapy room. Today was a courtroom. Today had stakes that extended far beyond anything they had walked into before. He got up and went to the kitchen, where Scout was already sitting by his bowl with the alert, cheerful readiness of a dog who does not understand Monday mornings or court dates, but understands very well that his person is awake earlier than usual, and therefore something interesting is probably about to happen. Harold filled the bowl, watched Scout eat, then sat down at the kitchen table with his own coffee and looked at his dog for a long moment. "You know what today is," he said. It wasn't a question. Scout lifted his head from the bowl and looked at Harold with those amber eyes that always seemed to be paying attention to something slightly deeper than the surface of whatever was happening. Harold nodded slowly, as though the dog had responded. Then he got up, found the good brush, the one he kept for important occasions, and spent 20 minutes carefully grooming Scout's coat until it gleamed the deep, warm gold of late afternoon sunlight. He adjusted the fit of the blue therapy vest with the same meticulous attention a parent gives to a child's school clothes on the first day. He checked the certification documentation twice, then placed it in the front pocket of his folder alongside the court order and Dr. Osai's clinical notes. He was ready by 7:15. He sat in his armchair by the front window and waited, Scout settled at his feet, both of them watching the gray March morning arrive outside the glass. Lily was at the Foster family's home on the west side of the city, a warm, carefully kept house where a woman named Margaret Tillman had been caring for her for the past 6 weeks. Margaret was not a complicated person. She was practical and kind, and had fostered 17 children over the course of 12 years, which meant she had developed the particular gift of knowing when to press and when to simply leave space. With Lily, she had learned very early that space was what was needed: wide, unhurried, undemanding space in which the child could exist without being asked to perform or respond or be anything other than exactly what she was. On the morning of the hearing, Margaret woke Lily at 7 with the same quiet routine she used every morning: a gentle hand on the shoulder, a soft word, the smell of breakfast already moving through the house. She had laid out Lily's clothes the night before after a careful, private deliberation. Not the yellow daisy dress that felt too cheerful, too at odds with the weight of the day. Instead, a soft blue sweater the color of a calm sky, dark leggings, and the small brown boots that Lily had chosen herself 3 weeks earlier at a consignment store, and had worn as often as possible ever since, with the particular devotion children attach to objects that feel like theirs in a world where very little does. Lily sat up in bed and looked at the clothes. She looked at them for a long moment without expression. Then she reached out and touched the sleeve of the blue sweater. Margaret Tillman stood in the doorway and breathed carefully and said nothing, because she understood that this was Lily deciding, in her own time, in her own way, whether today was something she was willing to walk toward. After a moment, Lily swung her legs over the side of the bed. Margaret exhaled quietly and went back to the kitchen to finish breakfast. Dana arrived at the Foster home at 8:15. Lily was sitting at the kitchen table in her blue sweater and brown boots, in front of a plate of scrambled eggs that she had eaten approximately half of. She looked up when Dana came through the door, a brief, direct look that Dana had learned to read over months of working with this child. It wasn't a greeting exactly. It was more like an acknowledgement. "I see you. I know what today is. I am still here." Dana crouched down to Lily's level and said good morning in the calm, unhurried voice she reserved for the child, a voice stripped of everything except honesty and steadiness. "Scout is going to be there," she said. "Harold is bringing him. He'll be right next to you the whole time." Lily looked at Dana for a moment. Then she looked down at her boots. Then she picked up her fork and ate the rest of her eggs. Dana stood up and exchanged a glance with Margaret Tillman across the kitchen, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said better. They arrived at the Franklin County Courthouse at 8:50. The building rose gray and solid against the colorless March sky, its stone facade worn smooth by decades of weather and the thousands of people who had climbed its front steps, carrying the weight of circumstances they hadn't chosen. Dana parked in the lot on the south side and sat for a moment before getting out, her hand still on the wheel. In the back seat, Lily was looking out the window at the courthouse. Her face was unreadable in the way it always was, that still, contained expression that gave nothing away. But her right hand, Dana noticed, was pressed flat against her own chest, not the two-fingered signal, just her palm, pressed over her heart, the way a person presses a hand over something they are trying to hold together. Dana got out of the car, opened the back door, and helped Lily out onto the pavement. The cold hit them immediately, sharp and clean and relentless. Harold Voss was waiting at the bottom of the courthouse steps. And beside him, sitting perfectly straight in his blue therapy vest, coat gleaming in the gray morning light, was Scout. The moment Lily saw him, something shifted in her posture, something almost imperceptible, the way a person's shoulders drop a fraction when they walk into a room and see the one face they were hopping to find. She didn't run to him. She didn't smile. But she moved toward him with a directness and a purpose that stood in complete contrast to the careful stillness she maintained everywhere else. Scout stood as she approached, His tail moved, not the wild, enthusiastic wag of a dog greeting someone exciting, but a slow, steady movement, deliberate, like a metronome set to the pace of something calm. Lily reached him and pressed her hand into his side. Scout leaned into her hand. Harold Voss looked at Dana over the top of Lily's head, and Dana nodded once. They climbed the courthouse steps together. The social worker, the handler, the dog, and the small girl in the blue sweater and brown boots who hadn't spoken in 6 months and was walking toward one of the hardest rooms she would ever enter in her life. The heavy front doors of the courthouse opened before them. Inside, courtroom 7 was already full. And nobody in that room, not the attorneys, not the officials, not the stenographer with 16 years of experience, not even the Honorable Margaret Albright herself, was prepared for what was about to happen. But Scout was. Scout was always prepared. That was the one thing in all of it that never changed. The clock on the wall of courtroom 7 read 9:03 when Judge Margaret Albright called the proceeding to order. Her gavel came down once, not hard, not theatrical, just the single clean sound of authority settling into its place, and the low murmur of the gallery went immediately silent. That was the effect Margaret Albright had on rooms. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to repeat herself. 22 years on the bench had given her a presence that communicated, without any ambiguity whatsoever, that things were going to proceed in an orderly and purposeful manner, and that any deviation from that expectation would be addressed swiftly and without sentiment. She surveyed the courtroom from the bench with the practiced efficiency of someone taking inventory. Attorneys at their tables, check. Court stenographer in position, check. Bailiff at the door, check. Gallery seated and quiet, check. And then, in the specially arranged seating area to the left of the main floor, a small girl in a blue sweater sitting very still in a chair that was slightly too large for her small brown boots not quite reaching the floor. Beside her, on a designated mat that Harold Voss had positioned with careful precision the moment they entered the room, a golden retriever lay with his head up and his amber eyes fixed on the child with an attention so complete and so unwavering that several people in the gallery had already noticed it and found themselves unable to look away. Judge Albright noted all of it, filed it, and called the hearing to order. The first 40 minutes preceded the way family court hearings in Franklin County typically proceeded, which is to say, with the particular combination of formal language, procedural rhythm, and barely suppressed human anguish that characterizes a legal system trying to process something deeply painful through the machinery of rules and documentation. Gerald Fitch made his opening statement in the measured, unhurried tones of a man who had made thousands of opening statements and knew exactly how to construct one. The defense attorney followed, his voice carrying a slight roughness that might have been a cold or might have been the weight of what he was being asked to argue. Dana Pressler sat beside Lily, hands folded on the table in front of her, her expression carefully neutral. Lily sat perfectly still. She had been still since they entered the room, the same contained, unreachable stillness that had characterized her for 6 months. Her hands were laced together in her lap. Her eyes were downcast, fixed on some indeterminate point on the floor between her boots. She was not visibly distressed. She was not visibly anything. She had retreated to the place inside herself where the outside world could not reach her, and from the outside it looked like composure. It was not composure. Dana knew the difference. Dr. Oz had spent weeks teaching her to see it, the microscopic signals that distinguished Lily's genuine calm from her protective shutdown. The slight tension in the jaw, the way her fingers, though laced together, pressed fractionally harder against each other every few minutes. The breathing, slightly too controlled, slightly too deliberate, like someone concentrating hard on a task that should be automatic. Lily was holding herself together with everything she had. And Scout knew it. He had known it since they entered the building. His amber eyes had not left the child for a single moment since they sat down, tracking her with the focused, unblinking attention of an animal whose entire nervous system is calibrated to detect the frequencies of distress that humans are too clumsy and too distracted to perceive. His breathing was slow and audible, each exhale a quiet, steady rhythm that he seemed to be projecting outward, offering it to Lily the way you might hold a lamp out to someone navigating darkness. Harold Voss sat beside him, leash loose in his hand, watching Scout watch Lily and reading in the dog's posture everything he needed to know about how the child was doing. Not well, getting worse. Slowly, incrementally, but unmistakably worse. He said nothing. There was nothing to say yet. He waited, the way he had learned to wait in 6 years of this work, with complete attention and complete stillness, and the absolute readiness to move the instant Scout told him it was time. It was 43 minutes into the hearing when everything changed. A court official, a heavy-set man in a gray suit named Robert Crane, who had worked for Franklin County Child Services for 19 years and had developed the particular professional armor of someone who reads difficult documents aloud for a living, picked up the Child Welfare Assessment Report and began to read. His voice was flat and practiced, the voice of someone who has learned to separate the words from their meaning as a matter of psychological self-preservation. He read dates and findings and clinical observations and case notes in the same even tone he might use to read a grocery list, because that was the only way to get through it. But the words themselves were not flat. The words were a detailed, clinical account of the night that had ended Lily Mee Harmon's ability to trust the world. The circumstances, the findings, the documented evidence of what a 3-year-old child had witnessed in the place that was supposed to be the safest place in her existence. The temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop. A woman in the gallery pressed her lips together tightly. One of the junior attorneys at Gerald Fitch's table looked down at the surface of the table and kept his eyes there. The stenographer's fingers moved over her keys with the mechanical steadiness of someone concentrating very hard on the mechanics of her job to avoid thinking about its content. And at the specially arranged seating area to the left of the main floor, something began to happen to Lily Mee Harmon. It started in her fingers. The hands that had been laced together in her lap began to tremble, a barely perceptible tremor, the kind that starts deep in the nervous system and works its way outward before conscious thought can intercept it. Dana saw it first and felt her own chest tighten in response. She shifted fractionally in her chair, angling her body slightly toward Lily in the way she had practiced a present without crowding, close without overwhelming. Then Lily's breathing changed. The careful, controlled rhythm she had maintained for 43 minutes began to fragment short, shallow pulls of air that didn't reach the bottom of her lungs. Her shoulders rose toward her ears in the slow, involuntary movement of a body preparing for impact. The color in her face shifted, going slightly pale beneath her dark curls. Her fingers uncurled from each other and pressed flat against her thighs. Robert Crane kept reading. Dana leaned forward by a fraction and said, barely above a breath, "Lily." Lily didn't respond. Her eyes had gone to that faraway place, the place where she went when the world became too much to be present in, the place that was safe precisely because nothing outside it could reach her there. Dana's hand moved toward the child's arm and then stopped. Dr. Oss had been explicit. In moments of acute distress, unexpected physical contact from humans could escalate rather than soothe. The protocol was to allow Lily space to use her own tools first. Her own tools. The signal. Dana looked at Scout. Scout was already standing. He had risen from the mat so smoothly and so silently that Harold Voss, who had been watching him with complete attention, said later that he almost missed the moment it happened. 1 second the dog was lying still. The next he was on his feet, every line of his body oriented toward Lily with the focused, purposeful intensity of an animal that has received information and knows exactly what to do with it. Harold did not pull the leash. He understood. And then Lily turned her head. It was a small movement, slow, deliberate, the careful turning of a child who is operating at the very edge of her capacity and conserving every resource she has. She turned her head away from the middle distance where her eyes had been fixed and looked directly at Scout. Their eyes met. And then Lily Mee Harmon, 3 years old, silent for 6 months, sitting in the most formal and frightening room she had ever been in, surrounded by strangers and fluorescent lights, and the flat, relentless voice of a man reading the worst night of her life back to her in bureaucratic language. Raised her right hand. Pressed 2 fingers slowly, deliberately, with absolute certainty, against the center of her chest. Held them there for 1 breath. And then extended them outward. Toward Scout. "I need you, come to me, I'm not okay." Scout moved. 4 steps, silent, purposeful, unhurried, across the mat and the small stretch of courtroom floor between them. Harold Voss moved with him, leash loose, hand steady, eyes clear. The dog reached Lily and placed his enormous, warm head directly in her lap, pressing the full, gentle weight of it against her trembling legs. Then he shifted his body, leaning his broad, golden side against her shins, and exhaled 1 long, slow, deliberate breath. Lily's fingers, which had been extended outward, came down and buried themselves in the fur behind Scout's ears. Her breathing, which had been rapid and fractured, began slowly, visibly, miraculously, to slow. Her shoulders dropped. Her jaw unclenched. The trembling in her hands quieted to stillness. The entire courtroom had stopped. Not paused. Stopped. Completely, absolutely, as though someone had reached into the room and pressed a hand against the chest of every person inside it simultaneously. Robert Crane's voice trailed off mid-sentence. He looked up from the document and then looked immediately back down at it, because looking up meant seeing what was happening, and seeing what was happening meant feeling it, and feeling it meant that the professional armor he had spent 19 years constructing was not, in this particular moment, going to hold. The stenographer set her pen down on the desk with a sound so small it should have been inaudible. In the silence of that courtroom, it was as loud as a stone dropping into still water. A woman in the second row of the gallery covered her mouth with both hands. Gerald Fitch, 27 years of practiced legal composure assembled around him like a fortress, turned in his chair to face away from the table. His shoulders moved once. Dana Pressler pressed her own hand flat against her chest and breathed. And at the bench, Judge Margaret Albright sat perfectly still and watched all of it, the child, the dog, the room full of people who had forgotten, for one suspended and extraordinary moment, that they were supposed to be somewhere else in their heads. She watched it for 4 seconds. Then she raised her right hand and spoke quietly, clearly, in a voice that carried through every corner of that silent room like something that had been waiting a long time to be said. "We stop." 2 words. The simplest possible sentence. And yet the way they landed in that courtroom, in that particular silence after that particular moment, they carried the weight of everything that had just happened and everything it meant. Not just a recess, not just a procedural pause, something larger, an acknowledgement, a recognition. An entire room of adults, trained and credentialed and armored in professional distance, being stopped in their tracks by a 3-year-old girl who had said nothing at all. Robert Crane set the document down. The clock on the wall read 9:46. And Judge Margaret Albright stood up from her bench. In 22 years on the family court bench, Judge Margaret Albright had developed a reputation for exactly one thing above all others: control. Not the cold, indifferent control of someone who has stopped caring about the human beings in front of them. Something more precise than that: the hard-earned, carefully maintained control of a person who cares enormously and has learned, through decades of sitting inside the most painful chapters of other people's lives, that losing herself in that pain helps no one. That the best thing she can offer the people who come before her bench is not her emotion but her steadiness, her clarity, her absolute refusal to be moved off the foundation of reason and procedure that makes justice possible. She had presided over termination of parental rights hearings that had reduced entire courtrooms to tears, while she sat behind her bench and kept her voice level and her judgment clear. She had read case files at her desk at night that would have kept most people awake for a week, and walked into her courtroom the next morning composed and ready. She had looked into the eyes of people who had done terrible things to children. The most difficult thing, she had always privately believed that her job required of her, and delivered her rulings without allowing her personal horror to color her judicial reasoning. Control, always control. The bench as boundary, the role as armor. On the morning of that Tuesday in March, Judge Margaret Albright stood up from her bench and walked away from all of it. The courtroom processed what was happening in stages. First came the sound, the soft, distinct sound of the judge's chair pushing back from the bench, a sound that everyone in that room had heard hundreds of times at the end of a session, but had never, not once, heard in the middle of one. It was such an unexpected sound in such an unexpected moment that several people in the gallery didn't immediately understand what it meant. Then came the sight of her standing. And then, the thing that would be described in courthouse hallways and living rooms and television segments for months afterward. The thing that made people who heard about it later shake their heads slowly and say they wished they had been there to see it. Judge Albright came around the bench. She didn't rush. She moved with the same measured, deliberate pace she brought to everything, but there was something different in it today. Something stripped of the formality that usually accompanied her movement through the courtroom. She wasn't the judge walking to her chair or the judge addressing the gallery. She was a woman crossing a room because something had happened that required her to cross it. She passed Gerald Fitch's table. He didn't look up, and later he wouldn't be able to explain why, only that it felt in that moment like the right thing to do was to be very still and not interrupt whatever was happening. She passed the court stenographer, who had still not picked her pen back up from the desk where she had set it when Scout moved to Lily. The stenographer said afterward that she had simply forgotten it was there. She passed the defense attorney, who was watching her with an expression he couldn't control, something open and unguarded that he would have been embarrassed by in any other moment. She reached the specially arranged seating area and stopped. And she stood there for a moment, looking down at what was in front of her. Lily Mee Harmon, 3 years old, dark curls framing a face that was still pale from the distress of the last several minutes, both hands buried deep in the fur behind Scout's ears, her breathing slow and returning to something approaching steady. Scout lay against her legs with his head in her lap, amber eyes half closed, breathing in the long, measured rhythm that he seemed to project outward like a signal. This is how we breathe now. Follow me. They were so still together, so completely and perfectly still. The child and the dog existing in their own quiet frequency, the rest of the courtroom falling away around them like it belonged to a different world. Judge Albright looked at them for a long moment. She had 3 grandchildren. People who appeared before her bench rarely knew this because she kept her personal life rigorously separate from her professional one. But she had 3 grandchildren, and the youngest of them was 4 years old, and looking at Lily Mee Harmon sitting in that chair with her hands in Scout's fur, Judge Albright felt something move through her chest that had nothing to do with the law. She crouched down. The gallery made a sound, barely audible, a collective intake of breath, a ripple of movement as people leaned forward in their seats. Judge Margaret Albright, in her black robe, crouching on the floor of her own courtroom in front of a 3-year-old girl and a golden retriever, was not something any of them had a framework for. It didn't fit any category of things they had seen before. It simply was what it was, A woman setting down something heavy that she had been carrying for a long time, and being, for one moment, just a person in a room with a child who needed someone to see her. She didn't speak immediately. She looked at Lily. Lily looked back at her, those wide, dark eyes taking in this woman in the black robe, who had come down from the high place where she had been sitting and was now at eye level, which was different. Everything is different at eye level. Everything is more honest. Scout lifted his head from Lily's lap and looked at Judge Albright with the calm, assessing gaze he gave everyone new, reading her the way he read all people, looking for whatever it was he looked for, finding apparently what he needed to find, and then lowering his head back into Lily's lap. Judge Albright watched him do this. Then she looked back at Lily and spoke, quietly, directly, in a voice she had not used in this building before, not the judge's voice, something older and simpler than that. "You're okay," she said. "You're right here and you're okay." Lily looked at her for a moment. Then she looked down at Scout. Then she looked back up at the judge. And something happened in her face, something small and barely there, the ghost of something that might, in a different moment and a different world, have become a smile. Judge Albright held her gaze for another second. Then she stood, straightened her robe with the precise, habitual gesture of someone returning to themselves, and turned to Dana Pressler, who was sitting very still in her chair with her hands pressed flat on the table and her eyes bright in a way she was clearly working hard to control. The judge spoke quietly, but in the silence of that courtroom, every person heard every word. "This child will have everything she needs, not next week, not after further review, today. Whatever she requires, therapeutic, legal, protective, we address it in this room, right now, with the urgency it deserves. No more delays, no more procedures taking priority over a 3-year-old's well-being." She paused. "Are we clear?" Dana Pressler said yes. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Gerald Fitch said yes. He didn't look up when he said it, but he said it clearly and without hesitation, and Dana noted that and filed it away as something she hadn't expected from him. The defense attorney said yes. Judge Albright nodded once. Then she walked back across the courtroom floor, went around the bench, and sat back down in her chair. She picked up her pen. She looked out at the room, at the attorneys and the officials and the gallery, full of people who were all, in various stages, and with varying degrees of success, trying to reassemble the professional composure that the last several minutes had quietly dismantled. She gave them a moment. Then she called the hearing back to order. What happened in the remaining hour of that hearing was, in procedural terms, remarkable. Decisions that had been deferred for weeks were made. Protective measures that had been tangled in bureaucratic review were approved. A timeline for Lily's permanent placement, a process that had been moving with the grinding, impersonal slowness of an overloaded system, was restructured around the child's therapeutic needs rather than around administrative convenience. Dana Pressler said afterward that she had attended hundreds of child welfare hearings in 11 years and had never seen a proceeding move with such clarity and such speed. It was as though the room had been recalibrated, as though everyone inside it had been reminded, by a 3-year-old girl and a golden retriever, of what they were actually there to do. Gerald Fitch, who Dana had written off 3 weeks earlier as an obstacle to be managed, turned out to be an unexpectedly effective advocate when he decided to be one. He pushed his own team hard in the final hour of that hearing. Dana caught his eye across the table at one point, and he gave her a look she couldn't entirely decode, something complicated and honest, and then turned back to the matter at hand. At 12:17, Judge Albright closed the hearing. She gathered her papers. She made her final notes. She did everything she always did at the end of a session in the methodical, unhurried way that was entirely characteristic of her. Then, just before she rose to leave, she paused. She looked at Scout, who was back on his mat now, lying quietly beside Lily, who had fallen into the light, exhausted doze of a child whose nervous system has been through more than it was built for and is finally, gratefully, standing down. Judge Albright looked at them for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote something in the margin of her notes. 3 words, private, seen by no one else in the room. She never confirmed publicly what those 3 words were. But Patricia, her clerk, who knew her better than almost anyone, said that, when she collected the judge's notes later that afternoon to file them, she saw the 3 words before she realized she was reading them. She said they were simple. She said they were the kind of thing a person writes when they have witnessed something that reorganized something inside them, and they need to put it somewhere before it disappears. She never repeated them publicly either. Some things that happen in courtrooms belong only to the room where they happened. That evening on the courthouse steps, the reporters were waiting. Judge Albright had been warned they would be there. She had prepared, in the car on the way down, to say nothing. Standard judicial protocol in an ongoing case was not to speak to the press, and she knew it and respected it and had followed it without exception for 22 years. She reached the bottom of the steps and the cameras found her immediately, microphones extended, questions beginning before she had fully stopped walking. She stopped. She looked at the microphones. She thought about a small girl in a blue sweater pressing 2 fingers to her chest and extending them toward a dog. She thought about what it means to be 3 years old and to have already learned that the safest way to tell the world you need help is in a language it can almost miss if it isn't paying attention. She thought about what it means to preside over a system built to protect children and to ask yourself, honestly, whether it is doing that as well as it should. And then Judge Margaret Albright, who had given exactly 0 impromptu press statements in 22 years on the bench, looked into the nearest camera and spoke. "I have presided over thousands of testimonies," she said. "Thousands. In 22 years. I have heard things in this building that I will carry with me for the rest of my life." She paused. The crowd of reporters went completely still. "Today, a 3-year-old child who has not spoken in 6 months walked into my courtroom and delivered the most powerful testimony I have ever witnessed. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to." Another pause, longer this time. "And that dog understood her better, faster, and more completely than any of us did. Sometimes this system needs to stop. Stop the procedure, stop the language, stop the machinery, and remember that there is a child inside the case file. Today, that child reminded us. I am grateful she did." She nodded once at the cameras. Then she turned and walked to her car. The clip was on every major news network before 9 o'clock that evening. By midnight, it had been shared 4,200,000 times. And in a quiet house on the west side of Columbus, a little girl in a blue sweater was asleep on a couch with a stuffed golden retriever tucked under her arm, while Margaret Tillman sat in the armchair across the room and watched her breathe and thought about how much had changed today, and how much still needed to change, and how sometimes the most important things that happen in the world happen quietly, in small gestures. Between a child and a dog, in a room full of people who almost weren't paying close enough attention to see them. Almost healing is not a moment. This is the thing that nobody tells you when you are waiting for someone you love to come back from the place trauma has taken them. You imagine it as an event, a morning when they wake up different, a session where something cracks open and the light gets in all at once, a single word spoken after months of silence that signals the end of the hard part and the beginning of the better part. You imagine it as a door swinging open. It is not a door swinging open. It is a hairline fracture in a wall that has been built over a very long time to keep something unbearable out, and then another fracture, and another, until one day you look at the wall and realize that what you thought was solid has become something you can see through, and then something you can step through, and then something that is no longer entirely a wall at all. That is what healing looked like for Lily Mee Harmon in the weeks and months after that Tuesday in March. Not a door, a wall fracturing slowly in the quiet of ordinary days. The morning after the hearing, Lily slept until 9:15. Margaret Tillman let her sleep. She moved through the house with the careful quietness of someone who understands that rest is not laziness but recovery, that a nervous system that has been through what Lily's had been through the day before needed time and stillness to process and repair itself, the way a body needs sleep after physical exertion to rebuild what has been used. When Lily finally appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her pajamas, dark curls loose and tangled from sleep, Margaret had oatmeal waiting on the stove and the particular quality of unhurried morning quiet that she had learned, in 12 years of fostering, was one of the most healing things she could offer a child, the simple, steady message that today there is no urgency, no performance required, nothing you need to be except exactly what you are. Lily sat at the kitchen table and ate her oatmeal. She looked out the window at the gray March morning. She pressed her palm flat against the table, not the signal, just her hand, feeling the solidity of the surface beneath it. Margaret sat across from her with her own coffee and said nothing, and asked nothing, and simply existed in the same space as the child, which was all Lily needed from her, and which Margaret gave freely and without resentment, because she understood that sometimes the most important thing a person can do for another person is simply refuse to leave. The Wednesday session with Dr. Osai and Scout happened 3 days after the hearing. Dana Pressler drove Lily across the city in the early afternoon, the radio off, the heater humming quietly. Lily sat in the back seat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the passing streets, watching the city go by with the same careful, observing quality she brought to everything, taking in information, filing it somewhere inside herself in whatever system she had developed for making sense of a world that had proven itself capable of being very unsafe. When they pulled into the parking lot of Dr. Osai's building and Lily saw Harold Voss standing at the entrance with Scout sitting at his feet, coat gleaming, blue vest straight, amber eyes already moving toward the car, something happened in Lily's face. Not a smile, not yet, but the architecture of one, the slight softening around her eyes, the fractional relaxation of the careful stillness she maintained everywhere else. The expression of someone who has spotted the one thing in their field of vision that they are certain about. She was out of the car before Dana had fully turned off the engine. She walked directly to Scout and pressed both hands into his fur, and stood there for a long moment with her eyes closed, just breathing, just feeling the warmth and the weight of him, just being near the one presence in her world that had never once asked her to be anything other than what she was. Harold Voss looked at Dana over Lily's head. Dana looked back at him. Neither of them spoke. There was a whole conversation in that look, and all of it was understood. The session that day was different from all the ones that had come before it. Dr. Osai noticed it immediately, a quality of presence in Lily that had not been there before the hearing. Not openness exactly, not readiness to speak, something more subtle than that. The difference between a window that is shut and a window that is shut but no longer locked. They went through the usual routine, the movement exercises, the sensory activities, the nonverbal communication practice with Scout. Lily engaged with all of it with the same careful, deliberate attention she always brought to the sessions. But there was something underneath it that Dr. Os kept noticing and kept recording in her notes with the quietly excited precision of someone watching a process unfold that they have been hopping to see for a very long time. Lily was initiating. Small things, barely perceptible things, guiding Scout to a specific corner of the room rather than following Harold's lead, choosing which activity to do next by pointing rather than waiting to be directed, looking at Dr. Osai directly and holding the eye contact for 3, 4, 5 seconds at a time instead of the brief flickers of the previous months. She was reaching toward the world. Carefully, incrementally, with the caution of someone who has been burned and has not forgotten it but has decided, in spite of that, to reach anyway. Dr. Ose wrote in her session notes that evening that she believed they were approaching a threshold. She couldn't say when or how. Healing on Lily's timeline meant that predictions were unreliable and expectations were counterproductive. But something was building. Something was accumulating in the quiet of these ordinary Wednesday afternoons, session by session, the way water accumulates behind a dam until one day the structure it has been pressing against can no longer hold the weight of it. She was right. She just didn't know it would happen the following Wednesday. It was an ordinary afternoon in May. The kind of afternoon that arrives after a long winter and makes the world feel possible again. The air soft and warm, the trees outside Dr. Osai's window showing the fresh, almost painfully green leaves of early spring, the light coming through the glass at an angle that felt like a different season than the one the hearing had happened in. Lily was sitting on the floor, her preferred position during sessions, cross-legged on the soft rug with Scout pressed against her left side, her right hand moving slowly through the fur along his back. Dr. Ose sat across from them, close but not crowding, present but not pressing. The room was quiet in the way it often was in these sessions, a purposeful quiet, a working quiet, the silence of two people and a dog engaged in something that didn't require words to be real. Dr. Osai was making a note in her file when it happened. She didn't hear it coming. There was no build-up, no preparation, no signal that anything was about to change. One moment the room was quiet, the next moment it was not. Lily opened her mouth and said a word. One word, soft and rough and imprecise, the way a voice sounds when it has not been used in a very long time and is finding its shape again, like a door swinging open on hinges that have grown stiff from disuse, creaking slightly with the effort but opening nonetheless, opening fully, letting the light through. She said, "Scout." Dr. Karen Osai went absolutely still. She did not move. She did not speak. She did not react in any visible way whatsoever, because she understood with every cell of her professional training that this moment was made of glass, and that any sudden movement, any expression of excitement or surprise, any shift in the quality of the room's attention might shatter it before it had a chance to become something more. She breathed. Scout lifted his head from Lily's lap and looked at the child. And Lily, looking back at him with those wide, serious, dark eyes, said it again. "Scout." Clearer this time, more certain, the voice of someone who has tested a word and found that the world did not fall apart when they said it, and so has decided to say it once more to be sure. Then Lily looked up from Scout and looked directly at Dr. Osai, and said, in a voice so quiet it barely disturbed the air between them, "He came." 3 syllables. 3 syllables that contained everything: 6 months of silence, a courtroom, a signal, a dog crossing a mat in 4 steps, a judge stepping down from her bench, an entire room of adults stopped in their tracks by the smallest gesture in the room. "He came." Dr. Karen Osai set her pen down on her notepad with a hand that was not entirely steady. She looked at Lily for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "Yes, he always comes." Lily looked at Scout. Scout looked at Lily. And in the soft May afternoon light of that small therapy room in Columbus, Ohio, Lily Me Harmon smiled. Not the ghost of one, not the architecture of one. A real smile, wide and sudden and completely unguarded. The smile of a child who has been somewhere very dark for a very long time and has just, finally, found her way back to the surface and felt the warmth of something good on her face. Dr. Osai called Dana Pressler 20 minutes later. Dana pulled her car to the side of the road and sat there for a long time with both hands over her face, crying in the particular way people cry when they have been holding something tightly for so long that releasing it feels almost physical. A loosening in the chest, a pressure dropping, the relief of a weight set down after months of carrying it. In the months that followed, Lily's world rebuilt itself the way real things rebuild, slowly, imperfectly, stubbornly, with setbacks and quiet victories and ordinary days that were valuable precisely because they were ordinary. She moved into a permanent foster placement in late April, a family named the Hendersons, in a quiet Columbus suburb with a backyard and a dog of their own, a gentle older beagle named Pepper who regarded Lily with the mild, benevolent curiosity of an animal who has seen enough of the world to be surprised by very little. Lily and Pepper reached an understanding within the first week that seemed to require no negotiation whatsoever. She started preschool in September. Her teacher, a young woman named Ms. Reyes who had been briefed carefully on Lily's history before the school year began, reported at the first parent-teacher conference that Lily talked constantly about butterflies and clouds and a golden dog named Scout who she saw every Wednesday, about the color of the leaves and the sound the wind made and the way oatmeal tasted better with brown sugar than without, about everything, about all of it. Making up for lost time with the focused, joyful determination of a child who has rediscovered her voice and intends to use every bit of it. She still had hard days. She still had moments when the wall went back up and the stillness came over her and the world outside her own mind became too much to be present in. Healing is not linear and recovery is not a destination, and anyone who told you otherwise was selling something. But the hard days came less often, and they ended sooner, and each time they ended, Lily came back a little more fully than the time before. The story of what happened in Courtroom 7 changed things beyond Columbus. Legislation was introduced in 6 states within 8 months of the hearing, formalizing the use of certified facility dogs in child welfare and family court proceedings. Judge Albright testified before a state judiciary committee in October and spoke for 45 minutes without notes, something her clerk Patricia described as the most impressive thing she had ever watched the judge do, which was saying something considerable. Harold Voss and Scout were invited to conferences, training programs, and advocacy events across the country. Harold did the talking at all of them. Scout did what Scout always did, walked into a room full of people carrying difficult things and made them feel, without explanation or effort, that those things were survivable. Dr. Karen Ose published a paper in a peer-reviewed child psychology journal about the role of animal-assisted therapy in trauma recovery for pre-verbal and selectively mute children. It was cited 43 times in its first year. Dana Pressler was promoted. She used the new position to push for systemic changes in how Franklin County's Child Welfare Department approached trauma-informed care. She kept a photograph on her desk, taken by Margaret Tillman on a sunny afternoon in the Hendersons' backyard, of Lily running through grass with her arms out, laughing, Scout galloping beside her, both of them absolutely and completely free. And every night, in the Henderson house in the quiet Columbus suburb, Lily Mee Harmon went to bed in a room with yellow curtains and drawings of dogs covering the wall, and a window that looked out on the backyard, where Pepper slept in a patch of evening light. She had a stuffed golden retriever that she took to bed every night without exception. She had named him on the first night she brought him home, holding him up to show her foster mother with the solemn, considered expression of a child announcing something important. Her foster mother had asked what his name was. Lily had looked at the stuffed dog for a moment. Then she had looked up. "Judge," she said. Her foster mother had asked her why. And Lily, 4 years old now, voice fully returned, words coming easily and constantly and with great enthusiasm for anyone who would listen, had thought about it for a moment with the serious, careful expression she brought to important questions. Because, she said finally, she came down. Her foster mother didn't fully understand the answer at the time. Later, when she learned the full story of what had happened in Courtroom 7, the bench, the woman in the black robe, the crouching down, the eye level, the 2 words that stopped everything, she understood completely. and she never asked Lily to change the name. Some voices don't need words to be heard. Some heroes have 4 legs and a coat the color of autumn honey. Some moments inside cold gray courtrooms remind an entire watching world what it means, what it has always meant to truly see a child. Lily came in silent. Scout came certain. A judge came down from her bench. And a little girl found her way back to her voice. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. And